The intersection of 3rd Avenue and East 46th Street, Midtown Manhattan, is unremarkable in the way that most of New York City is unremarkable: a crosswalk, a traffic signal, office towers on the corners, the compressed daily movement of one of the densest concentrations of people on Earth. On December 16th, 1985, at approximately 5:30 in the afternoon, two men were shot and killed on a sidewalk 1 block east of that intersection, outside a restaurant called Sparks Steakhouse at 210 East 46th Street. The dead men were Paul Castellano, the boss of the Gambino crime family, and his bodyguard and newly appointed underboss, Thomas Bellotti. The sidewalk around them when the shooting happened was crowded with office workers heading toward the subway, Christmas shoppers moving along the block, and tourists navigating the Midtown grid in the weeks before the holiday. The killers wore trench coats and fur hats and disappeared into that crowd before the first police car arrived. The name of the man who fired the fatal shot into Paul Castellano's head was known to federal investigators within 6 years. A cooperating witness with direct knowledge of the planning and the execution provided it. A civilian who had been walking along East 46th Street that evening and had come upon the scene as it was happening identified the shooter in open court. The name was John Carneglia. John Carneglia was never charged with that murder. He spent the following 29 years in federal custody for heroin trafficking, the product of a prosecution built on wiretap recordings made 3 years before the assassination inside the suburban Long Island home of a Gambino captain who had been assured by someone he trusted that the telephone he was using was safe. The prosecutors who convicted Carneglia knew what he had done outside Sparks Steakhouse. They decided not to charge him because he was already going away for 50 years, and a man already serving 50 years does not require an additional murder charge to spend the foreseeable future inside federal institutions. This is the story of how a junkyard operator from Queens became the trigger man at the most consequential organized crime assassination in American history, and then disappeared from the official record of that crime entirely. Drop where you are watching from in the comments below. It is genuinely one of the best parts of doing this. If you are new here and want more history, like this delivered straight to your feed, subscribe now. Back to Ozone Park and the junkyard and the man who would one day stand outside a Midtown Manhattan steakhouse with a gun in his hand. Ozone Park in the decade after the Second World War was the kind of Queens neighborhood that organized itself around a specific set of loyalties that outsiders could see the edges of but rarely the interior. It sat in the southwestern section of the borough, close to the Aqueduct racetrack and within the flight paths of aircraft approaching Kennedy Airport to the east. It was a working-class neighborhood in the way that phrase carried specific meaning in post-war New York, Italian-American in its dominant culture, organized around parishes and social clubs and the informal hierarchies of community life that existed beside and occasionally in direct connection with the more formal hierarchies of organized crime. The men who ran things in that neighborhood were known, and the line between knowing them and working for them was not always a line anyone needed to cross deliberately. Sometimes it was simply the direction things moved in for a young man from that particular block with the particular qualities that the organization valued. John Carneglia was born on May 21st, 1945. His brother Charles arrived the following year on August 10th, 1946. The details of their early lives before the organization claimed them are not extensively documented in the public record. What is documented is the geography they grew up in, who controlled it, and what the direction of travel looked like for young men from that neighborhood with the specific qualities the organization was looking for. The Gambino crime family's presence in Ozone Park was organized around a capo regime named Carmine Fatico, who relocated his crew from East New York in Brooklyn to the Ozone Park neighborhood at some point in the early 1970s, establishing headquarters in a pair of connected brick storefronts at 9804 101st Avenue. The place was called the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club, a name derived from Bergen Street in Brooklyn, but misspelled in the transition, which gave it a history even in its title of being something slightly different from what it appeared to be. The club conducted no actual hunting and no actual fishing. It was where the men of the crew gathered, played cards, conducted business, and maintained the organizational life of a unit that answered to the Gambino family's underboss, Agnello della Croce. Fatico faced loan sharking charges in the early 1970s and was ordered, as a condition of bail, to stay away from his crew and known associates. Operational authority over the Bergen transferred to a younger man whom Fatico trusted with the day-to-day running of the crew's affairs. That man was John Gotti. Fatico officially named Gotti the crew's captain in 1977, formalizing a transition that had been functionally complete for years. By then, Gotti had built the Bergen crew into the Gambino family's most productive earning unit under Della Croce's sponsorship and had established a presence in the Ozone Park community that made the club an institution rather than just a location. Part of what made the Bergen what it was involved a straightforward insight about community relations. Gotti hosted annual 4th of July celebrations on the block, providing food and fireworks and a neighborhood gathering that built genuine goodwill among the residents who lived around the club. Those same residents, grateful and not inclined to cause trouble for men who threw good parties, became an informal early warning network for law enforcement activity in the area. When federal agents appeared in the neighborhood, word reached the Bergen before the agents reached the door. The club, from Gotti's perspective, was as close to untouchable as a criminal headquarters in a city full of federal investigators could be, and the community that surrounded it was part of the reason why. John Carneglia came into this world through the proximity that the neighborhood created. He and Charles were part of the Ozone Park community that organized around the Bergen, and the transition from neighborhood figures to organizational figures was, in that context, a matter of demonstrating the qualities that earned inclusion, rather than making any formal decision to join something. The Carneglia brothers were loyal. They were useful, and they had something the crew needed that had nothing to do with the club on 101st Avenue. They had the junkyard. The Carneglia brothers operated an auto salvage business on Fountain Avenue in East New York, Brooklyn, a 77,000 square foot site run under the corporate name Statewide Auto Parts. It was a legitimate business with a legitimate license, processing the end-of-life vehicles and wrecks that accumulated in any major urban area, extracting salvageable parts, and cycling what remained through the ordinary commercial stream of industrial recycling. The business could be explained to anyone who asked. It functioned in the ordinary commercial sense well enough that the explanation was available whenever one was needed. What could not be explained in the same ordinary commercial terms was what the site was used for when the legitimate business of processing wrecked automobiles was set aside. The junkyard on Fountain Avenue in East New York was the visible portion of the Carneglia operation. It was not the most consequential portion. The junkyard served more functions than any auto salvage license described or any state inspection was designed to detect. The first was stolen property. Vehicles taken in connection with hijackings and the organized car theft pipeline that ran through the Gambino family's transportation enterprises arrived at Fountain Avenue for disassembly. Parts with value were stripped and sold. What remained entered the legitimate recycling operation. The presence of stolen vehicles inside a salvage yard was difficult to separate from the presence of legitimately acquired vehicles, which was precisely why auto salvage facilities had always been attractive to criminal enterprises with large quantities of vehicles to process quickly and quietly. The second function was narcotics. The junkyard became, over time, a node in the heroin distribution network that the Bergen crew was building. The specifics of how the facility supported the drug operation were established through wiretap recordings that would eventually produce federal charges. The junkyard connected the physical infrastructure of the operation to the supply chain and financial arrangements that the Carneglia organization had developed alongside Gene Gotti, the boss's brother, and Angelo Ruggiero, who held the crew's most significant relationships in the narcotics world. The third function was the one that distinguished the Fountain Avenue junkyard from every other criminal enterprise operating in New York City during those years. Bodies were brought to Fountain Avenue and did not leave in any form that the city's medical examiner would ever receive. The method, established through cooperating witness testimony and federal investigation, was acid applied in containers large enough to accommodate a human body. John Carneglia was described by those witnesses and by prosecutors as the man who administered this process. The testimony also described him removing jewelry from the bodies before dissolving them, taking that jewelry to his home, where it was hung from the basement rafters. How many people ended this way at Fountain Avenue was never established with the precision that individual criminal charges against John Carneglia specifically required. Several of the disappearances connected to the site entered the legal record through testimony about the practice without producing convictions against him. The most documented case connected to the junkyard was that of John Favara. In March of 1980, Favara, a Howard Beach resident who lived 2 houses from the Gotti family home, accidentally struck and killed Gotti's 12-year-old son Frank with his car on a neighborhood street. The boy had been riding a mini bike. The death was ruled an accident. Favara received threats in the weeks that followed and was advised by those who understood the situation that moving was necessary for his safety. Before he completed the move, in the summer of 1980, he was abducted from the parking lot outside his workplace in New Hyde Park. Federal investigators concluded that he was taken to the Fountain Avenue junkyard, murdered, and dissolved in acid. His remains have never been found. John Carneglia's participation in the Favara disappearance is considered established by law enforcement, but was never charged against him as a separate criminal count. In 1981, the junkyard received the bodies of 3 Bonanno crime family captains, Philip Giacconi, Dominic Trinchera, and Alphonse Indelicato. The 3 had been conspiring against the imprisoned Bonanno boss, Philip Rastelli. Paul Castellano, as a favor to Rastelli, permitted Rastelli's associates to execute all 3 men during what had been presented as a meeting inside a Gambino social club. The bodies were then delivered to Carneglia for disposal. 3 organized crime captains, men who had commanded hundreds of soldiers and associates between them, ended on Fountain Avenue with no remains ever recovered. Against this specific documented background, a different kind of detail entered the record during the 1970s. John Carneglia discovered a 12-year-old boy named Kevin McMahon sleeping in the pool house attached to his residence. The circumstances that had put the boy there, alone and without shelter, are not fully described in the public record. What is documented is that Carneglia took McMahon in and functioned as his surrogate father for the following decade, providing housing, structure, and eventually an introduction to the organizational world that surrounded everything Carneglia did. When Carneglia entered federal custody in 1989, supervision of McMahon passed to Charles, who continued the boy's involvement as a Gambino associate. In 2009, Kevin McMahon became a government witness and testified against Charles at trial. The coexistence of these documented facts, the acid-filled barrels and the boy in the pool house, the bodies of men dissolved into nothing, and the child sheltered and raised was not resolved as a contradiction requiring explanation in any of the legal proceedings that eventually addressed the Carneglia operation. It was simply part of the record of who John Carneglia was and what the world he built around himself contained. Paul Castellano had made himself as clear as a man in his position could be made about narcotics. He had inherited the Gambino crime family from Carlo Gambino, who died of natural causes on October 15, 1976, at his home in Massapequa, New York. Gambino had led the family since 1957 and had built it into the largest and most profitable of the New York families, with interests in labor unions, construction, the garment district, the waterfront, and loan sharking operations that reached across the city's legitimate economic sectors. His decision to name Castellano as his successor over the underboss, Aniello Della Croce, who commanded the loyalty of the street crews, was a choice that reflected Gambino's confidence in Castellano's business acumen rather than his organizational standing with the men who did the day-to-day work of the family. Castellano ran the family from a mansion on Todt Hill in Staten Island that his subordinates called the White House. He preferred intermediaries to direct contact with street-level operations, built the family's involvement in construction and labor unions into a systematic enterprise of bid rigging and extortion, and ran the organization with a corporate sensibility that distinguished his style from the more viscerally street-level approach of the bosses who had preceded him. He was not, by temperament, a man who spent his evenings in social clubs in Queens. His prohibition on drug trafficking was not a preference or a policy suggestion. It was a rule with a specific penalty attached. Drug dealing in Castellano's Gambino family was punishable by death. His reasoning was consistent with a clear-eyed assessment of how narcotics prosecutions had destroyed large portions of the organized crime world in the preceding 2 decades. The federal sentences available under narcotics law were severe enough to make informants out of men who would otherwise honor omerta, and the visibility of drug money attracted sustained federal attention that threatened the labor and construction rackets generating the family's most reliable income. The Gotti crew at the Bergen had been dealing heroin since approximately the late 1970s. Gene Gotti, Angelo Ruggiero, and John Carneglia had built a heroin distribution network that sourced product and moved it through supply chains connecting them to distributors across Queens and the surrounding area. They were aware of Castellano's prohibition. They proceeded anyway, operating under the assumption that their relationship with Della Croce provided sufficient insulation from the consequences that Castellano had threatened. The FBI's Gambino squad had been developing a strategy for penetrating the family's operations under Special Agent Bruce Mao. The strategy depended on identifying figures who were both operationally important and organizationally careless, men whose position gave them knowledge of the family's significant activities and whose personality made sustained silence difficult. Angelo Ruggiero met both criteria more completely than almost anyone else in the organization. His nickname was Quack Quack, applied by people who understood him with the precision of a description that required no elaboration. He visited associates frequently. He discussed organizational business on telephones. He expressed opinions about the family's leadership and direction in terms that made his conversations a primary intelligence resource for anyone who could arrange to hear them. The FBI obtained permission to place a wiretap on Ruggiero's home telephone on November 9, 1981. The phone was listed in the name of his daughter, Princess Ruggiero, not his own, because Ruggiero had told associates that this specific line was safe to use. The FBI had received this assessment from confidential informants and planted the tap in direct response to Ruggiero's stated confidence in it. The recordings that accumulated through the following months captured conversations between Ruggiero, Gene Gotti, and John Carneglia concerning the mechanics of their heroin operation with the specificity of men who believed they were speaking privately. In one documented exchange from June of 1982, they coordinated the movement of heroin and the management of the money it generated. On June 11th of that year, Carneglia and Ruggiero flew from LaGuardia Airport to West Palm Beach, Florida, to advance the narcotics enterprise, a trip the court would later charge separately. On June 23, 1982, Carneglia, Gene Gotti, and associates possessed approximately 2 kilograms of heroin in connection with their distribution network. The tapes created a danger that extended well beyond the legal consequences they would eventually produce in a federal courtroom. Castellano had been demanding access to the recordings since the investigation became known, seeking to determine what the conversations actually contained. If he heard those tapes, the men on them would face not the manageable uncertainty of a federal trial, but the immediate and permanent consequences that Castellano had promised in advance to anyone who violated his prohibition. The men on the recordings understood this. The drug operation had created a situation with no comfortable resolution. The FBI had their conversations. Their boss wanted those conversations, and the calendar was moving in one direction only. The arrest came on August 8, 1983. Angelo Ruggiero, Gene Gotti, John Carneglia, Michael Coiro, and Mark Ryder were taken into federal custody on charges that had accumulated through nearly 2 years of surveillance. The 12-count superseding indictment that followed charged them with engaging in a continuing criminal narcotics enterprise, conspiracy to violate the racketeer-influenced corrupt organization statute, and various other counts related to heroin trafficking. The The scope of the indictment reflected the scope of what the FBI had documented across almost 17 months of listening. The arrests made the situation confronting the Bergen crew visible to the entire Gambino organization. Castellano immediately sought access to the tape recordings that had produced the indictment. The FBI and the prosecution resisted sharing those recordings before trial, which created a holding period during which Castellano's frustration was apparent to everyone who dealt with him, and the men whose voices were captured on the tapes waited to see how that frustration would eventually resolve. Della Croce was the barrier. As underboss, as Ruggiero's relative, and as the patron of Gotti's entire organizational career within the Gambino family, Della Croce had sufficient authority to delay any action by Castellano against the arrested men while the legal process ran its course. His position was not one of ignorance about what the recordings contained. He knew enough. His priority was maintaining organizational peace, long enough for the courts to produce whatever outcome they would produce, keeping the family from turning on itself before the legal situation clarified. But Della Croce was dying. The cancer advancing through his body through 1984 and 1985 was removing him, by degrees, from the functional role that had protected the Bergen crew. In February of 1985, Gotti himself was indicted on federal racketeering charges, along with Della Croce and multiple Bergen associates, in a case assembled by a federal prosecutor named Diane Giacalone. The indictment alleged loan sharking, extortion, and illegal gambling coordinated through the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club. The racketeering case against Gotti was moving toward trial at the same time that his brother and Carneglia were navigating the preliminary stages of the drug prosecution. Della Croce died on December 2nd, 1985. His death changed the calculation that Gotti had been managing for more than 2 years. Without Della Croce as the organizational buffer between Castellano and the conclusions the tapes would produce, the timeline for Castellano's response to the drug violation compressed into something urgent. The protection that had held the situation in suspension since August of 1983 was gone. What remained was a straightforward organizational arithmetic. Castellano was alive. The men whose voices were on his recordings were alive, and the two conditions could not coexist indefinitely. By December of 1985, the calendar had a specific logic. Della Croce was dead. Castellano wanted the tapes, and the men whose voices were on them had arrived at the conclusion that the calendar had only one more page. The planning for what was about to happen on East 46th Street had been underway for weeks, organized by a man who understood that the distance between a plan and a catastrophe was the reliability of the people executing it. On December 15th, 1985, 11 conspirators gathered at the Stillwell Avenue office of Salvatore Gravano to finalize the arrangements for the following evening. Gravano, who would become one of the most consequential cooperating witnesses in organized crime history 6 years later, was part of the planning and contributed to its logistics. The 4 designated shooters for the evening of December 16th were Vincent Artuso, John Carneglia, Eddie Lino, and Salvatore Scala. The 4 men were to position themselves near the entrance of Sparks Steakhouse, dressed in trench coats and fur hats, concealing their features from the pedestrians who would be moving along the block during the evening rush. Anthony Rampino, known as Tony Roach, was to stand across the street as the backup shooter. Angelo Ruggiero, Joseph Watts, and a third associate would be stationed at the corner of 46th Street and 2nd Avenue to facilitate the escape after the shooting. Frank DeSico was to be inside the restaurant, where a business meeting had been arranged that Castellano and Bellotti understood to be a routine gathering. 2 other capos, James Failla and Daniel Marino, would also be inside as genuine participants in what they had not been told was the backdrop for an assassination. John Gotti and Sammy Gravano would observe from a car parked at the corner of 3rd Avenue and East 46th Street, monitoring the approach with a walkie-talkie. The following afternoon, Paul Castellano and Thomas Bellotti drove toward Midtown Manhattan in a black Lincoln Town car. Castellano was 70 years old. He had led the Gambino family for 9 years, building its construction and labor union enterprises into a systematic operation that reached into virtually every major building project in New York City. He had kept his distance from the rough texture of street-level organized crime, preferring the isolation of the White House and the intermediaries who carried his decisions to the men who executed them. He was traveling to a meeting at a steakhouse in Midtown that he had every reason to believe was what it appeared to be. At a red light at the corner of 3rd Avenue and 46th Street, Castellano's car stopped beside Gotti's car. The tinted windows of Gotti's vehicle prevented Castellano from seeing the men inside. The light changed. Both cars moved east on 46th Street. At 5:30 in the evening, as the sidewalk around them carried the ordinary December crowd of a Midtown Manhattan block, Paul Castellano and Thomas Bellotti stepped out of their car in front of Sparks Steakhouse. The 4 gunmen in trench coats moved from their positions near the restaurant entrance. Castellano was shot 6 times. One of the bullets entered his head. According to the account that Sammy Gravano provided to federal investigators after turning state's evidence in 1991, the gunman who fired the fatal shot into Paul Castellano's head was John Carneglia. Thomas Bellotti was shot and killed as he emerged from the driver's side. He had been unarmed that evening. The gunmen moved into the foot traffic on the block and were gone. Gotti and Gravano drove slowly past the scene to confirm the result. Within minutes, the NYPD and FBI were assembling around 2 bodies on a Midtown Manhattan pavement, in the portable lighting that made the scene visible for blocks, and everyone who arrived at the crime scene understood immediately that what had happened on East 46th Street that evening was not a routine homicide. A man named Jeffrey Davidson had been walking along East 46th Street after leaving his office in a nearby Midtown Public Relations company. He stepped off the curb between 2 parked cars when he heard the volley of shots, came upon the scene as it was ending, and observed the shooter at close enough a range that he was able to provide a description and an identification. He testified about this at the Gotti trial in 1992, identifying the man he had seen with gestures that the courtroom observed and the press reported. His account corroborated in the open record what Gravano had already told investigators about Carneglia's specific role. No charges were ever filed against John Carneglia for the murders of Paul Castellano and Thomas Bellotti. After Gravano identified him and Davidson confirmed the identification from the stand, federal prosecutors made a decision that the arithmetic of the situation made straightforward. Carneglia was already serving a 50-year federal sentence for heroin trafficking. Adding a murder charge to a 50-year sentence accomplished nothing that 50 years did not already accomplish. The resources required for a homicide prosecution would be directed elsewhere. The body on the sidewalk outside Sparks Steakhouse would remain, as far as John Carneglia's official criminal record was concerned, an event to which he was connected by testimony and witness account, and not by any formal charge bearing his name as defendant. The most consequential thing John Carneglia ever did in his criminal career never appeared on his criminal record. John Carneglia had already walked out of one federal courtroom acquitted when the heroin trials began their extended run through the court system. In early 1987, Carneglia, John Gotti, and other Berghain crew members stood trial on the federal racketeering charges that prosecutor Giacalone had assembled, including loan sharking, illegal gambling, murder, and armed hijackings. The prosecution was the government's most comprehensive attack on the Gotti crew to that point. On March 13, 1987, the jury returned acquittals across the board. The verdict made John Gotti a tabloid phenomenon. Newspaper editors reached for a metaphor about nonstick cookware and produced a nickname that would follow him through the remaining years of his freedom: the Teflon Don. Within the organization, the acquittal reinforced the conviction of the men around Gotti that his specific quality of fortune extended to everyone he protected. The racketeering case had proved nothing could stick. The heroin case, which had been running its own parallel course through the courts since the arrests of August 1983, was about to test that theory. The first heroin trial began in federal court on June 1st, 1987. The government's case rested on the recordings from Ruggiero's Cedarhurst telephone, the documented travel to Florida, the June 1982 heroin possession, and the broader pattern of organizational involvement the tapes had established. In October of 1987, the FBI received information from confidential sources indicating that efforts were being made to influence individual jurors. An investigation followed. On January 19th, 1988, Judge Mark Costantino declared the first heroin trial a mistrial. A second heroin trial commenced before Judge Joseph McLaughlin, to whom the case had been reassigned. This second attempt at conviction produced no verdict at all. On July the 27th, 1988, the jury was unable to reach a unanimous decision, and Judge McLaughlin declared the second mistrial on the drug charges. 2 attempts, 2 mistrials, one through what the government characterized as direct interference with the jury process, one through the ordinary uncertainty of 12 people who could not agree. The men around Gotti had reason to believe the pattern could continue indefinitely, that the organization could manage jury outcomes the way it managed most other obstacles, through patience and the specific leverage that the Gambino family had always been able to apply. The third heroin trial commenced before Judge James Bartels on April 17th, 1989. The indictment had been redacted and reorganized into 5 counts that presented the essential case without the accumulated complexity of the prior proceedings. On May 23, 1989, the jury returned guilty verdicts against John Carneglia and Gene Gotti on racketeering conspiracy, narcotics conspiracy, and possession of heroin with intent to distribute. Carneglia was additionally convicted on the Travel Act count, arising from the June 1982 trip to Florida with Ruggiero. Judge Bartels sentenced both men on July 7, 1989. The sentence for John Carneglia was 50 years in federal prison, structured as 20 years on the racketeering conspiracy charge, 15 years on the narcotics conspiracy charge, and 15 years in the possession count, all running consecutively, with a 5-year concurrent term on the Travel Act violation. The fine was $75,000. Gene Gotti received the identical sentence and the identical fine. Angelo Ruggiero, who had been charged alongside them and whose conversations had produced the entire case, did not survive to serve anything the conviction produced. His own sentencing, almost certainly deferred as his health collapsed through the summer and fall of that year, became moot when the lung cancer advancing through his body ended his life on December 5, 1989, 5 months after the jury returned its verdict. The man whose telephone Carneglia had discussed heroin shipments on, who had told his associates that the phone listed in his daughter's name was safe to use, died without serving a day of what the recordings he made had generated for the men around him. The specific irony embedded in John Carneglia's conviction had a precise geometry. He had allegedly stood outside Sparks Steakhouse 4 years earlier and shot the boss of the Gambino crime family in the head, and that act had produced not a single day of the sentence he was now beginning to serve. The 50 years came from conversations on a phone in a house in Cedarhurst, recorded by an agency that had been listening for more than a year before the first arrest, produced by the specific quality of carelessness that the organization around Ruggiero had never successfully managed to suppress. At some point during the years of trials and mistrials, federal prosecutors approached John Carneglia and Gene Gotti with an offer. The terms of the arrangement are not documented in precise detail in the public record. What is documented through multiple accounts of the period is that a plea agreement was available that would have resulted in a prison sentence of approximately 10 to 15 years. The specific conduct they would have been required to admit and the specific structure of the deal are not part of the formal record. What is part of the record is that the offer was made, that it was declined, and that the decision to decline it was not, in any meaningful sense, the decision of the men who would spend the next 3 decades paying for it. John Gotti had a philosophy about legal proceedings that he communicated to the men around him with the clarity of someone who had thought the matter through to a firm conclusion. You did not plead guilty. You went to trial. You trusted the organization and the people around you to produce the outcome that loyalty and discipline deserved. This philosophy had produced visible results. The March 19th, 87 racketeering acquittal was real, and real acquittals reinforced real philosophies. especially philosophies that told men they were protected by something more durable than anything a prosecutor could offer them across a conference table. When the plea arrangement was proposed, Gotti instructed Carneglia and his brother Gene to refuse it and go to trial. The accounts of this period describe his instruction as clear and not negotiable. The organization's principle was that you did not admit guilt. The organization had managed jury outcomes before. The organization would manage this one. The organization managed it twice, through 2 mistrials that produced no convictions and no time in federal custody, and every apparent reason to believe that the third attempt would reach the same destination. The third attempt produced a conviction that no organizational management could undo because the voices on the recordings were the voices on the recordings, and the evidence was not a question of interpretation that 12 people could be guided to resolve differently. Consider the arithmetic that became clear only after the verdict. A sentence of 10 to 15 years, accounting for the federal credits and reductions available to defendants who served their time without incident, would have meant release for both men somewhere around the year 2000 or 2002 at the latest. John Carneglia would have been in his mid-50s. Gene Gotti would have been in his early 50s. The world they would have returned to would still have been the world that John Gotti controlled, the Gambino family still operational, the Bergen crew still intact, the operations still generating income. Instead, both men served 29 years. John Carneglia walked out of a halfway house in Brooklyn in June of 2018 at the age of 73. Gene Gotti emerged from federal custody in September of that same year at 71. The world they returned to was not the world of 2002. It was a world in which John Gotti had been convicted in 1992, had spent a decade in federal custody dying of throat cancer, and had died at the medical center for federal prisoners in Springfield, Missouri on June 10, 2002, without having spent a single free day after his conviction. The man who had ordered them to refuse the deal and trust the process had not been free himself for the final decade of his life. The math of loyalty had a final number, and it was 29 years. While Carneglia began serving those years, the world he had left behind continued measuring the distance in its own way. The junkyard on Fountain Avenue outlasted the men who ran it, but not by the margin that anyone who had known either Carneglia brother in their prime would have expected. John Carneglia entered federal custody in the summer of 1989. His brother Charles continued operating within the Gambino organization in his absence, and the supervision of Kevin McMahon, the boy who had been found in the pool house and raised into an organizational associate, passed to Charles as part of the informal inheritance of responsibility that the organization produced when a key figure disappeared into the federal system. McMahon had grown from a 12-year-old runaway into a functioning Gambino associate by the time John left, and the world he occupied after 1989 was Charles's world. The Gambino family itself was undergoing the transformations that sustained federal prosecution and cooperating witnesses produce in any organization. John Gotti's 1992 conviction and life sentence ended the period in which the Bergen crew had defined the family's strategic direction. The years that followed eroded the network of relationships and operational connections that had made the Fountain Avenue junkyard one functioning node in a larger criminal enterprise. Key figures were convicted, associates turned. The infrastructure that had made the Carneglia operation possible lost the organizational support that had sustained it through 2 decades. The Fountain Avenue site was identified in federal civil forfeiture proceedings as property of Statewide Auto Parts, Inc., the corporate name through which the Carneglia brothers had operated the junkyard. The forfeiture action established that proceeds of illegal activity had flowed through the business, allowing the government to assert its claim to assets connected to criminal enterprises through a legal mechanism that did not require a separate criminal conviction for each specific asset. In 2009, the owners of the 77,000 square foot property applied for a zoning variance that would have converted the site into a storage and maintenance facility for 125 buses. The application attracted press coverage that revisited the junkyard's history in considerable detail, which is not the kind of background that typically accompanies a routine variance proposal. Local opposition cited the residential zoning of the surrounding neighborhood. The variance was contested. By February of 2008, Charles Carneglia had attracted the sustained attention of an investigation that produced one of the largest organized crime roundups in decades. On February 7th, 2008, 62 defendants were arrested in a sweep that reached the Gambino family's current acting boss, acting underboss, consigliere, 6 captains, 16 soldiers, and numerous associates. Charles was among the defendants, facing charges that included racketeering, murder, and drug trafficking. Kevin McMahon, who had slept in John Carneglia's pool house in the 1970s, who had been raised through the following decade as a surrogate son, and who had been passed to Charles's supervision when John entered federal custody, appeared at Charles's trial in 2009 as a government witness. His testimony contributed to the case against the man who had overseen his organizational activities after John's imprisonment. The path from the pool house to the witness stand covered approximately 30 years and a distance, measured in organizational terms, that the 12-year-old sleeping in the outbuilding could not have anticipated when John Carneglia first found him there. Charles was convicted of 4 murders. The first was the 1977 stabbing death of Michael Cotillo during a dispute outside a Queens diner. The second was the 1983 stabbing death of Salvatore Puma, a Gambino associate, over a financial disagreement involving commissary money owed to an incarcerated crew member. The third was the 1990 shooting death of Gambino soldier Louis De Bono in the underground parking garage of the World Trade Center, carried out on John Gotti's direct order after De Bono refused to appear when summoned to meet with the boss. The fourth was the 1990 felony murder of Jose Delgado Rivera, an armored truck guard shot and killed during a robbery at John F. Kennedy International Airport. At sentencing, the judge also found, as relevant conduct, that Charles had committed the 1976 murder of Albert Gelb, a Brooklyn criminal court officer who had previously arrested Charles on a weapons possession charge and who was shot 4 days before he was scheduled to testify at the resulting trial. The jury had been unable to reach a unanimous verdict on that count specifically, but the judge made his finding through the standard of proof available at sentencing. Charles Carneglia received life in prison and a fine of $500,000. The 2 brothers who had built the junkyard together, who had grown up in the same Ozone Park neighborhood, who had entered the same organization through the same channels and served the same boss, ended on opposite sides of the same institutional divide, one serving 29 years and eventually released, one sentenced to die in federal custody. The operation they had built on Fountain Avenue was a federal exhibit by the time Charles received his sentence. John Carneglia was deep into his own federal sentence when his brother's trial took place and was not present. On June 11, 2018, John Carneglia walked out of a halfway house at 120th Street in Brooklyn, 73 years old and formally free of the federal obligation that had begun on July 7th, 1989. The world outside the halfway house door had changed in the ways that 29 years of American life always change a world. The Bergen Hunt and Fish Club at 9804 101st Avenue in Ozone Park had closed in 2005 and been converted into retail space. A Christian church occupied part of it. 4th of July celebrations that Gotti had used to build community goodwill and create an early warning network against law enforcement had not been held since before Gotti's conviction in 1992. The specific community infrastructure that had made the Bergen function as a base of criminal operations for more than 2 decades had dispersed across the intervening years into something unrecoverable. The men who had gathered in Gravano's office on Stillwell Avenue on December 15th, 1985, to finalize the plan for the following evening had reached various ends by the time Carneglia came home. John Gotti had died at the Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri, on June 10, 2002, after a decade of treatment for throat cancer that advanced, despite the medical care available to him in federal custody. Angelo Ruggiero had been gone since December of 1989, taken by lung cancer 5 months after the jury's verdict. Frank DeCicco, who who had been inside Sparks Steakhouse that December evening as part of the operational structure of the plot, was killed by a car bomb on April 13th, 1986, less than 4 months after the Castellano assassination, outside a social club in Bensonhurst. The bomb had been placed by Genovese family associates in retaliation for the unauthorized killing of Castellano. Gotti himself had changed his plans that morning and was not present at the scene when the device detonated. De Chico was. Eddie Lino, one of the four designated shooters at Sparks, alongside Carneglia, was killed in November of 1990 when a gunman pulled alongside his car on the Belt Parkway, a killing later established to have been carried out by two New York City police detectives working as contract killers for the Lucchese family. Salvatore Scala, another of the Sparks shooters, died in federal custody. Gene Gotti emerged from the Federal Correctional Institution in Pollock, Louisiana on September 14th, 2018, 3 months after Carneglia's release, having served the same 29 years under the same sentence for the same operation, for the same reasons, having followed the same instruction from the same boss that had led both of them to refuse the same deal. The Castellano assassination remained, as a matter of John Carneglia's formal criminal record, unattributed to him. Gravano had identified him. Davidson had testified from the sidewalk outside Sparks. The prosecutors had chosen, with full knowledge of both accounts, not to file charges on the grounds that a man already serving 50 years required no additional conviction to accomplish what the criminal justice system had already accomplished. The body on the sidewalk outside Sparks Steakhouse appears in John Carneglia's documented history through the testimony of other men and not through anything bearing his name as defendant in a homicide case. He has kept a low profile since his release. The public record of his life after June of 2018 is limited to the fact of his release, his address at the halfway house when he left, and his age. He would be 80 years old in May of 2025. What he does with the time remaining in a world that has changed entirely from the one he inhabited when Angelo Ruggiero picked up a telephone that was supposed to be safe is not documented in any public source. The story of John Carneglia is, at its most specific level, the story of a man who committed what is widely regarded as the most consequential organized crime assassination in American history, and then spent 29 years in federal prison for a different crime entirely, one caught not through detective work or informant development, or the patient accumulation of a surveillance case built specifically against him, but through a telephone call made by a man who had been told the line was clean. That specific inversion reveals something about how the mechanics of criminal prosecution actually operate in practice, removed from the dramatic version of the process that dominates the cultural understanding of it. The Castellano murder was known. The cooperating witness who provided the details had been present for the planning and the execution. The civilian who had been walking along East 46th Street when it happened had identified the shooter in open court. The information existed and was on record. The decision not to use it against Carneglia was not a failure of the investigation. It was a rational calculation made by prosecutors who understood that a defendant already serving 50 years needed nothing added to his sentence to satisfy the objectives that criminal prosecution exists to serve. The arithmetic produced a clear answer and the machinery moved on. This is the specific mechanism by which some of the most serious criminal acts in American history remain without formal legal resolution, not because the government failed to identify the person responsible, not because the evidence was insufficient to support a conviction, but because the prosecution of a different crime had already produced consequences sufficient for the system's practical purposes. The men who gathered around Gravano's table on December 15th, 1985, to finalize what would happen the following evening, left behind an inventory of outcomes that reads as a record of what the Gambino family's peak years ultimately produced. The boss they created that night was convicted within 7 years and died in federal custody. The underboss, who became the government's primary witness against that boss, eventually faced his own prosecution. The man positioned inside the restaurant died in a car bomb 4 months after the killing. Two of the four designated shooters died violently in the years that followed. One died in federal prison. One came home after 29 years. John Carneglia came home for heroin, with the murder of Paul Castellano appearing in his documented history only through the testimony of other men and through no proceeding that named him as responsible. The junkyard on Fountain Avenue in East New York, where stolen cars were dismantled and stripped, where heroin moved through a criminal supply chain, where the bodies of men, including three Bonanno crime family captains, were dissolved in acid and never recovered, where a 12-year-old runaway was discovered sleeping in a pool house and raised into a surrogate son who would eventually testify against the family that had sheltered him, no longer operates as a junkyard. The Berg and Hunt and Fish Club is retail space. The organization that demanded and received the specific loyalty that John Carneglia gave it across 4 decades no longer commands the city it once controlled in the ways that the public record has spent decades establishing, and the sidewalk outside Sparks Steakhouse on the block of East 46th Street between 2nd and 3rd Avenues in Midtown Manhattan has no marker. Millions of people have walked across it in the 40 years since December 16th, 1985, heading to meetings and restaurants and subway entrances and Christmas shopping, with no particular reason to look down at the pavement beneath their feet or to know what happened there in the last minutes of the evening rush on a Monday in December, when a man in a trench coat and a fur hat stepped forward from a position near a restaurant entrance and fired the shot that changed the direction of organized crime in New York City and was never charged for it.